The sound of a basketball thudding against the pavement echoed faintly as I sat in my truck, parked a block away from the school gym. The engine was off, and the air was thick with summer heat, yet I couldn't bring myself to roll the window down. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my eyes locked on the gym doors as a slow trickle of teenage athletes wandered outside, sweaty and laughing. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't a paranoid man, and this wasn't me. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. It started with Elizabeth's recent commitment to fitness. 2 weeks ago, she had declared she wanted to start going to the school gym after hours. It's just cardio, she had said nonchalantly, tying her running shoes while I tried to catch the news on TV. Mr. Tanner has been kind enough to let me use the gym after practice since we don't have one at home. Sam Tanner, the PE teacher. Everyone at the school loved him, including Elizabeth, who seemed to think the sun shone out of his perfectly toned backside. I didn't pay much attention at first because, honestly, why would I? He was a teacher, not a movie star. But over the past week, something began gnawing at me. It wasn't Elizabeth's gym obsession, it was her smile when she talked about it. Not the usual I'm proud of myself kind of smile, but the sort that looked like it was hiding something. And she didn't look like someone coming back from an hour on a treadmill. The clothes she left in the laundry didn't smell like sweat. I was going crazy, I thought. I didn't want to be one of those guys, the kind who suspects their wife for no reason and starts shadowing her movements like a bad private detective. But here I was, parked a block from the school, dressed like an idiot in a baseball cap and sunglasses like I belonged in some low-budget crime show. Then it happened. The gym doors creaked open, and out walked Sam Tanner, his gym bag slung casually over his shoulder. He paused near the entrance, looking over his shoulder and flashing a grin at someone inside. I held my breath. A moment later, Elizabeth stepped out. It wasn't just that she was there. It was how she looked. Her hair, tied up in a way she only ever did for a night out, bounced as she moved, and her face was glowing, not sweaty, glowing, like she'd just walked out of a spa. She laughed at something Sam said, her voice carrying just faintly through the quiet evening air. Sam stepped closer to her, leaning in, and I looked away, while rising in my throat. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I was misreading the situation. Maybe this was just two co-workers talking. But the way she shifted her weight toward him, the little laugh that lingered too long, and the playful way she swatted his arm told me everything I needed to know. I felt my chest tighten, anger and disbelief colliding in a sickening cocktail. Elizabeth turned her head toward the street for just a second, and I ducked like a damn fool, nearly hitting my head on the dashboard. My heart pounded as I peeked again, just in time to see them disappear around the corner of the building. Around the back. For a split second, I thought about leaving, pretending I hadn't seen anything, pretending nothing was wrong. But my gut screamed at me. I needed to know know what was going on. I stepped out of the truck as quietly as I could, my feet crunching against gravel. I didn't have a plan. What was I going to do? Confront them? Yell? Ask my wife why she was sneaking around a high school gym with a guy who looked like he walked straight out of a fitness ad? I rounded the corner, and that's when I saw them. Elizabeth was pressed against the wall, her hands flat against Sam Tanner's chest as he leaned down toward her. It wasn't a kiss, not yet. But it was close enough. I froze. Time stopped. My mind screamed, say something. Do something, but my body refused to cooperate. I stood there, a sick, helpless spectator as my wife and the PE teacher stared at each other, their faces inches apart. Then Elizabeth spoke softly, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. You know I can't. Sam grinned and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Not yet. Something inside me snapped. Not yet. I turned on my heel, retracing my steps back to the truck, my blood pounding in my ears. My fists were clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms, but I didn't care. I couldn't watch anymore. My marriage, my life, had been a lie, and I was just now waking up to the fact. As I slammed the truck door shut, I gripped the steering wheel and stared blankly at the road ahead. My jaw was set, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She thinks I don't know. But I knew. And I wasn't going to let it slide. The drive home that night was quiet, too quiet, even for someone like me who usually found comfort in silence. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't crack open the window, didn't check my phone. I just sat there, white-knuckling the steering wheel, the image of Elizabeth and Sam Tanner burned into the back of my eyelids. The words not yet played on a loop in my head, grinding against my thoughts like sandpaper. I didn't know what pissed me off more, the fact that she was doing it or the fact that she didn't even have the balls to finish it yet. I pulled into our driveway and killed the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at our house, our home. The porch light was on, like always. A little welcome sign hung next to the door. If I didn't know better, it would have looked like the picture of domestic bliss. It was almost funny how normal everything appeared from the outside. But there was nothing normal about what was happening inside that house anymore. I walked in, and there she was, Elizabeth, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She looked up when she heard the door shut and gave me that same casual smile, the one she always used when she had something to hide but didn't want me to see it. "You're back late," she said, setting her phone down. "Busy day?" Busy day. That's what she said to me. After sneaking around the back of a high school gym with a PE teacher, that's what she opened with. I could feel something rising in my chest, rage, disgust, confusion, but I swallowed it down. Now wasn't the time to explode. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Had a late call for a repair over on 8th. Some guy's SC unit blew out." She nodded like she cared, but I could see her focus shift back to her phone. For a second, I wondered if she was texting him right then, sitting there across from me, the man she promised to love and honor. My fingers twitched, itching to snatch the phone out of her hands and see for myself, but I held back. No, grabbing her phone wouldn't do me any good. If there was one thing I knew about cheaters, it's that they're careful. And Elizabeth had always been careful. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, the cold biting at my fingertips, and sat down at the table across from her. She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "You okay? You're quiet." "Just tired." The lie came out easier than I expected. I wasn't tired. I was wide awake, my mind racing at 1,000 miles an hour. I needed a plan. The next morning, I decided to skip work. I didn't call in sick or offer an excuse, I just didn't go. My head wasn't in the right place to handle customers, and I didn't trust myself not to take out my anger on some poor guy whose air conditioner wasn't cooling fast enough. Instead, I spent the morning sitting in my truck a block away from the school again, sipping coffee and watching. It was the same routine as the day before. Sam Tanner came out first, fresh from the gym. A few minutes later, Elizabeth followed, wearing workout clothes that looked far too clean for someone who had supposedly been exercising. The two of them didn't linger in front of the building this time. Sam walked to his car, and Elizabeth got into hers. I watched as she drove off, and instead of heading home, I tailed her. Now, I'm no private investigator, but I know enough about cars and traffic to keep my distance. I stayed 2, sometimes 3 cars back, watching as she made her way across town. After about 15 minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop, one of those trendy places with overpriced drinks and pretentious names. I parked across the street and watched as she got out, checked her reflection in the window, and walked inside. Not 2 minutes later, Sam Tanner walked through the door. My stomach turned, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. I watched as they sat at a table in the corner, far enough from the other customers to avoid drawing attention. Elizabeth was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. Her head tilted slightly as she listened to him, and her hand brushed against his arm. It was subtle, but I noticed. I noticed everything. I stayed there for almost an hour, watching them talk, laugh, and sip their stupid coffees. They never kissed, never touched in a way that someone passing by would think twice about. But I knew. I knew what this was. You don't sit across from a man like that, smiling, leaning in, hanging on every word if he's just a coworker. Eventually, they stood up, Sam placing his hand on her lower back as they walked out. I watched as he held the door for her, and she laughed at something he said, her voice carrying faintly across the parking lot. They went their separate ways after that, Elizabeth back to her car, Sam to his. That should have been enough. I should have driven home, confronted her, demanded answers. But I didn't. Instead, I followed Sam. I don't know what I was looking for, proof, maybe, or some kind of closure. I watched as he drove to his apartment, parked, and disappeared inside. I sat there for another half hour, staring at the building, before finally heading home. By the time Elizabeth walked through the door that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone resting in front of me. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "You're home early. Everything okay?" "No," I replied. "It's not." Her smile faltered, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something else on her face, fear. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I didn't say anything. I just held up her phone. "Unlock it." She froze, her eyes darting to the phone and then back to me. "What are you talking about?" "Unlock your phone, Elizabeth." Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" "Because I've been to the school. I saw you leave the gym with Sam Tanner. I watched you meet him at the coffee shop this morning. So, if I'm being ridiculous, then prove it." "Unlock your phone." She didn't move. For a moment, I thought she might try to talk her way out of it, spin some story about how I was overreacting. But instead, she turned around, grabbed her bag, and started walking toward the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, standing up. "Out," she said, her voice shaking. "Out where?" "To see him?" "Go to hell, David," she snapped, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the empty space where she'd been. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt like it was caving in. I didn't need her phone. I didn't need her to admit it. I already knew. The woman I'd loved for nearly a decade was cheating on me, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to change it. I stood there for a few minutes, my fists at my sides, trying to process what had just happened. I had been waiting for her to deny it, to give me a lie I could tear apart. But no. She ran. She ran, that was as good as a confession. The next 2 hours were spent pacing around the living room, wearing a path into the carpet. I sat down, then stood back up. I opened a beer, took 2 sips, then poured it down the sink. My mind wouldn't slow down. Every detail of the last few weeks, hell, the last few months, started lining up like bricks in a wall I hadn't wanted to see. The night she came home late. The excuses about needing to clear her mind. The sudden interest in going to the gym. The way she pulled away when I reached for her in bed. I saw it all now, crystal clear. Sam Tanner. The high school PE teacher. A man 10 years younger than me with abs and an easy smile. Elizabeth didn't say his name much, but it was always in that offhand, casual way that made me realize she was trying not to say too much. At 10 o'clock, she still wasn't home. I checked my phone for the 10th time, my thumb hovering over her contact. I wanted to call her, scream at her, demand answers, but something in me refused to do it. I wasn't going to chase her. I'd wait until she came home, because she would come home and I'd get what I needed face to face. At 11:20, her car finally pulled into the driveway. I heard her slam the door shut and her footsteps on the porch. The lock turned, and Elizabeth walked in, looking like someone who'd spent the evening stewing in their own guilt and anger. Her hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, and her face was flushed. She froze when she saw me standing there in the middle of the living room, waiting. "You're still up," she said, her voice careful. I ignored her words. "Where were you?" "Out," she replied flatly, dropping her keys on the entryway table. "Out where?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "I needed to think, David. I don't owe you a detailed itinerary every time I leave the house. You owe me the truth." She blinked at me, feigning innocence. "What truth?" I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. "Don't do that. Don't stand there and act like I don't know what's going on. Don't insult me. I don't know what you're talking about. Asterisk Sam Tanner, asterisk I spat his name out like poison. Her face didn't flinch, but I saw the brief flicker in her eyes, panic, just for a second. I saw you. Twice now. At the gym, at the coffee shop. I saw how you looked at him. How he touched you. She said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Say something, I growled. Deny it. Tell me I'm crazy. Tell me you're not sleeping with the goddamn PE teacher. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, fixing her stare on the floor. Asterisk Elizabeth, asterisk I shouted, slamming my hand against the wall. Her head snapped up, and her face twisted in anger. What do you want me to say, David? That I've been seeing him? That I made a mistake? Is that what you want? Fine. There it is. Are you happy now? The words hit me like a brick to the face. I had expected it, sure, but hearing her say it, hearing her admit it, felt like getting kicked in the stomach. I stared at her, trying to keep my voice steady. How long? What does it matter? How long? She let out a breath, her shoulders slumping. 2 months. 2 months. 60 goddamn days. I felt a pulse of white-hot rage surge through me, but I shoved it down. Why? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past me into the kitchen, grabbed a glass from the cabinet, and poured herself a drink of water. My eyes followed her every move, my heart hammering in my chest. Why? I repeated, louder this time. She turned around, leaning against the counter. I don't know, David. It just happened. That's not an answer, I shot back. Things don't just happen, you didn't trip and fall into his bed. Why? What did I do? What didn't I do? Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. This isn't about you. Like hell it isn't. No, it's not, she snapped. It's about me. About how I feel. About the fact that for the last year, I felt like I was suffocating in this marriage. You're always working. Always tired. You come home, you eat dinner, you sit in front of the TV, and that's it. That's our life. And I can't do it anymore. I stood there, staring at her, stunned. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was full of shit, but the words wouldn't come. So you fixed it by doing it with another man? I said finally, my voice low. She flinched, and I saw her throat bob as she swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to go that far. But it did. Yes. And you didn't stop it. No. The anger I had been holding back erupted like a burst dam. You selfish, goddamn liar. I shouted, slamming my fist against the table so hard the glass of water shook. Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've thrown away? For what? For him, a PE teacher? Don't you dare judge him, she hissed, narrowing her eyes. You don't know him. I know enough. We stood there, glaring at each other like two people on opposite sides of a battlefield. My chest heaved, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything to make this feel real, but instead, I just stood there, shaking. Finally, Elizabeth broke the silence. What now? I looked at her, a woman I no longer recognized, and shook my head. I don't know. She grabbed her bag and turned toward the stairs. I'm going to bed. Don't bother, I said coldly. She paused, her back still to me. Sleep in the guest room. I don't want you near me. She didn't argue. Without another word, she walked up the stairs, her footsteps echoing faintly through the house. I sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the floor, my fists still clenched at my sides. Elizabeth had cheated. She had looked me in the eye and admitted it. And all I could think about now was what I was going to do next. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkened living room, listening to the faint creaks of Elizabeth moving around in the guest room above me. Occasionally, I'd hear the floorboards shift, as if she were pacing. Maybe she thought I'd come upstairs and continue the fight. Maybe she was rehearsing more excuses to throw in my face. Either way, she didn't know what I was planning. By the time the sun started crawling over the horizon, I had a list forming in my head. I wasn't going to yell anymore. Yelling was pointless. I wasn't going to beg for answers she couldn't or wouldn't give me. I was done playing the role of the pathetic husband. No, it was time for Elizabeth to feel the consequences of her betrayal. She had played me for a fool, but I'd make sure she didn't walk away from this unscathed. At 6 a.m., I got up and made coffee like I did every other morning, deliberately slamming the cabinet doors as I worked. I wanted her to know I was awake. I wanted her to hear me. By the time she finally shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing the clothes from the night before, I was sitting at the table with my mug in front of me, staring at her. She didn't say anything at first. She poured herself a cup of coffee, avoiding my eyes as she sat down across from me. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, but I let it sit. Let her stew in it. Finally, she looked up, her voice cautious. "Are we going to talk about this?" "We talked last night," I replied, my voice flat. "I don't need to hear anything else." Her brows furrowed, and I saw the faintest flicker of panic in her expression. "David." "I'm going to make this simple for you," I interrupted, leaning back in my chair. "You can pack a bag and leave today, or I'll make you wish you had." She blinked at me, stunned. "Are you threatening me?" "Call it whatever you want," I said, standing up. "But let me be clear. You don't get to blow up my life without consequences, Elizabeth. You made your choices. Now I'm going to make mine." I didn't wait for her to respond. I grabbed my keys off the counter and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. I could feel her watching me through the window as I got into my truck, but I didn't care. Let her wonder where I was going. Let her sit with the uncertainty. She had already ripped apart the foundation of our marriage. She could spend a day worrying about what I was going to do next. My first stop was Sam Tanner's apartment. I'd only been there once, a few months back when Elizabeth roped me into attending one of the school's charity events. Sam had been there, all smiles and charm, shaking hands and patting backs like he was running for office. I remember Elizabeth introducing us, her voice just a little too bright as she said, "David, this is Sam Tanner. He's been such a great help at the school." Yeah. I bet he had been. When I pulled up to the building, I felt the first pulse of doubt. What was I going to do? Confront him? Beat the crap out of him? I'd spent all night planning my revenge on Elizabeth, but I hadn't quite figured out what to do about him, the man who had so casually inserted himself into my life, my marriage, and my home. I climbed out of the truck and headed to the front door of the complex. It was unlocked, and I stepped into the quiet, dimly lit hallway. Sam's apartment was on the 3rd floor, and by the time I reached it, my hands were shaking with adrenaline. I knocked hard, 3 times. The kind of knock you don't ignore. When the door opened, Sam Tanner was standing there in gym shorts and a t-shirt, his hair still damp like he'd just stepped out of the shower. For a second, he looked confused, but then his face shifted, his expression hardening. "David." He said my name like he'd been expecting me. "Sam," I replied, my voice cold. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "What do you want?" "I want you to look me in the eye and tell me why you thought you could do that to my wife." Sam flinched, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped, stepping closer. "You think I don't know? I saw you with her." "I know." Sam's face paled, but he didn't back down. "Look, I don't want any trouble." "You are trouble, Sam," I shot back, cutting him off. "You think this is some joke? You think you can just waltz into my life, screw my wife, and walk away without consequences?" He didn't respond. For the first time, he actually looked scared, like he wasn't sure how far I was willing to take this. "Let me be clear," I continued, my voice low. You're going to stay away from her. I don't care what she told you, I don't care what promises she made. It ends now, do you hear me? Sam nodded quickly, his hands raised in surrender. Okay. I get it. No, I don't think you do. I stepped closer until I was inches from his face. If I so much as see you near her again, I will ruin your life. Do you understand me? I will call the school board. I will tell every parent, every teacher, and every goddamn student what you've been doing. I will make sure you lose your job, your reputation, everything. Are we clear? Yeah, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We're clear. Good. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him standing there in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't look back as I made my way down the stairs and out of the building. My hands were still shaking, but I felt calmer than I had in days. When I got home, Elizabeth was still in the guest room. I didn't bother checking on her. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and sat down at the kitchen table, pulling up our bank accounts, insurance policies, and every shared asset we had. If she wanted to blow up our marriage, I was going to make sure the fallout hit her harder than me. I started with the finances. We had joint savings, half of which I transferred to my personal account. I wasn't going to let her use my money to fund her new life. Then I started making a list. Change the locks. Speak to a divorce lawyer. Cancel her car insurance. Pull the records of every text and call she'd made in the last 2 months. By the time Elizabeth finally came downstairs, looking like she hadn't slept at all, I was ready. What are you doing? She asked cautiously. Taking care of business, I replied, not bothering to look up. She stood there for a moment, watching me, before finally saying, Is this how it's going to be? Yes, I said simply. This is how it's going to be. She didn't argue. Maybe she knew better than to try. By the time the day was over, Elizabeth realized the truth. I wasn't going to yell, cry, or beg. I wasn't going to let her win. I was going to take everything I could and leave her with nothing but the ashes. By the next morning, I had done enough groundwork to shift the power back to where it belonged, in my hands. My phone was loaded with the contact information of a divorce lawyer, bank transfer confirmations, and an appointment to have the locks changed the following day. I'd spent hours collecting emails, pulling up bills, and writing down every account number and password for shared assets. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Elizabeth spent most of the night holed up in the guest room. I'd hear her occasionally moving around, pacing, or crying softly, but I didn't care. If she wanted sympathy, she could go get it from her gym buddy. At 8 a.m., I finally saw her. She came downstairs dressed in her weekend casual outfit, jeans, a loose sweater, and no makeup. That had always been my favorite look on her. She looked real that way. Today, though, I saw none of that warmth. All I saw was a stranger pretending she still belonged here. Morning, she said quietly, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't look up from my laptop. You're still here? Her jaw tightened. This is still my home too, David. I let out a humorless laugh. You sure about that? I don't remember you treating it like your home when you were sneaking around with Tanner. She flinched. I saw it, and I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I don't want to fight, she said, walking slowly into the kitchen and pouring herself a cup of coffee. Well, that's great news, because I don't want to talk to you at all. I closed my laptop and stood up, finally looking her in the eye. She looked worn down, like she hadn't slept, like she'd spent the night thinking through everything that had already spiraled out of her control. I wondered if Sam Tanner had been part of those thoughts. Maybe she'd even called him to cry about how unfair I was being. I wouldn't have put it past her. She set her coffee down and turned to face me. David, please. We need to talk about this. What's there to talk about? I said flatly. You're cheating on me. You admitted it. There's nothing left to say. There's always something to say, she shot back, frustration creeping into her voice. We've been married for 9 years, David. Don't you think we owe it to each other to at least try to? To what? I cut her off, stepping toward her. To fix it? To work through it? Don't kid yourself, Elizabeth. This isn't a rough patch. This isn't something we can slap a band-aid on and call it even. You chose this. You chose him. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I made a mistake. I barked out a laugh, louder this time. A mistake? That's what you're calling it? Yes. Her voice cracked. A mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I felt lost. And Sam. Don't, I snapped, pointing a finger at her. Don't say his name to me. Don't talk about him. Don't even think about him while you're standing in this house. She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering away from mine. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, but then her shoulders slumped. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said softly. Bullshit, I replied. People don't cheat by accident, Elizabeth. You didn't just wake up one day and find yourself in the back of a gym with him. You made a choice. Every text. Every coffee shop meeting. Every goddamn moment you spent with him behind my back, that was a choice. Your choice. Tears started to gather in her eyes, but I wasn't letting up. And don't you dare stand there and tell me you felt lost, I continued, my voice hard. I was right here. I've always been right here. You didn't talk to me. You didn't ask me for help. You didn't tell me you were unhappy. You just went and do it with the first guy who made you feel special. Stop, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks now. Please, stop. Why? You don't like hearing the truth? You don't like having to face the fact that you ruined this? That you destroyed everything we built together? She covered her face with her hands, but I didn't feel any sympathy. This wasn't about her feelings anymore. This was about mine, about everything she had taken from me with her lies and her betrayal. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent except for her quiet sobs. I watched her, my chest tight, waiting for some kind of explanation that would make sense of all of this. But there wasn't one. I already knew that. Finally, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Do you still love me? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Did I? Could I? The woman standing in front of me wasn't the same woman I had fallen in love with. She wasn't the woman I'd built a life with. That woman was gone. No, I said finally, the word coming out colder than I expected. I don't. She flinched, like I'd slapped her. For a second, I almost felt bad. Almost. David, please, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want to lose you. You already did, I replied, turning to leave the room. You lost me the second you decided he was worth more than this marriage. It's over, Elizabeth. Where are you going? She called after me, panic rising in her voice. To my lawyer's office. She followed me into the living room, her footsteps quick and frantic. David, wait. Just wait a second. We don't have to do this. We can figure it out. I'll end things with Sam. I'll do whatever you want, just please, don't do this. I turned to face her, shaking my head. You don't get it, do you? This isn't something you can fix. This isn't something you can undo. You betrayed me, Elizabeth. You threw away everything we had for a cheap thrill, and now you want me to forgive you? To forget it ever happened? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. No, I said firmly. It's too late for that. Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands again. I stood there for a moment, watching her, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sadness. Just emptiness. I'll be back later, I said, grabbing my keys. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was taking back control. Elizabeth had broken everything, but I wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences. She wanted to play with fire? I'd make damn sure she got burned. By the time I got back home that evening, everything felt different. I hadn't even moved out yet, but there was this sense of finality in the air. Maybe it was because I had already signed the paperwork with my lawyer, or maybe it was because Elizabeth wasn't there when I walked in. Her car was gone from the driveway. I didn't care where she'd gone, whether it was to Sam's apartment or to some hotel to cry into a cheap bottle of wine. That was her problem now. I sat down at the dining table and opened my laptop. It was time to tie up the loose ends. There were a lot of them, but I wasn't going to let anything slip through the cracks. I went to her social media profiles, which she still hadn't locked down. That was her mistake. Most people think cheating is done in secret, but if you look close enough, you can see the signs. In the photos she posted over the last 2 months, there was a pattern: little things like tagging the gym in her stories, shots of her running errands, vague posts about self-care. It was obvious now. She'd been dropping breadcrumbs the whole time, as if she wanted someone to notice. One picture stood out. It was a shot from a coffee shop table, a fancy cappuccino, some open notebooks, and her sunglasses placed neatly on the side. At first glance, it seemed harmless, but I remembered that morning. That was the coffee shop where I'd seen her sitting with Sam. The caption read, *, sometimes, a little escape is exactly what you need. *. A little escape. I stared at the screen for a moment, my jaw tight. Then I saved the image to my desktop, along with a few others that made her alibis look thin. I wasn't a social media expert, but I knew enough to connect the dots. If she wanted to play games later during the divorce proceedings, I had receipts. I spent the next hour gathering more proof: texts she'd sent me saying she was working late, calendar entries about teacher meetings, old phone bills showing random numbers I hadn't questioned at the time. I organized everything into neat little folders on my computer. Bank transfers. Shared assets. Her affair. By the time I closed my laptop, I had everything I needed. It was like a calm had washed over me. Elizabeth came home around 8 o'clock. I heard her car pull into the driveway, but I didn't move from where I sat on the couch. She walked in slowly, like she was testing the waters. Her keys jangled in her hand as she set them on the table. "Hi," she said softly, her voice careful. I didn't answer. I just stared at the TV, where a rerun of some crime show played on mute. "David?" "What?" She sighed and stepped further into the room, crossing her arms over her chest. "Are we really going to keep doing this?" "Doing what?" I asked, finally looking at her. "Acting like everything's fine? Like you didn't blow up our marriage?" Her shoulders sagged. "I'm trying, David. I know I messed up. I know I did. But don't you think we can talk about this like adults? We already talked. You want to fix this? You want me to just sweep everything under the rug so you can feel better about yourself? It doesn't work that way, Elizabeth." "I didn't mean for this to happen," she muttered, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "You don't think I regret it?" "I do. I hate what I've done to us." "You hate getting caught," I corrected her. "That's what this is about. If I hadn't seen you with him, you'd still be sneaking around, wouldn't you?" Her silence was enough of an answer. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Here's how this is going to work. I met with my lawyer today. The divorce paperwork is ready. You'll get your copies tomorrow." Her head snapped up, her face paling. "You already talked to a lawyer?" "Of course I did," I said bluntly. "What did you expect me to do? Sit around and cry while you figure out if you want to keep screwing the PE teacher or not?" She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but I cut her off. "I've taken my half of the savings. I've already talked to the bank, and I've started moving my name off the bills. I've got everything documented, proof of what you've done. I'm not asking for a fight, Elizabeth, but if you try to make this difficult, I will drag you through the mud. Do you understand me?" Her lip quivered, and she looked down at her hands. "David, please." I don't want it to end like this. It's already over, I said coldly. You ended it the second you let him touch you. Tears started to slide down her cheeks, but I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not pity, nothing. I didn't recognize the woman sitting across from me anymore. I never wanted this, she whispered, her voice cracking. Neither did I replied. But here we are. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water just to give myself something to do. Elizabeth didn't move. She just sat there, crying quietly into her hands. I had nothing left to say to her. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't leave her a note. I didn't say goodbye. As I loaded my bag into the truck, I glanced back at the house one last time. It didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a building now, four walls that held too many bad memories. Elizabeth was watching me from the window, but I didn't wave. I didn't even look at her. I just climbed into the driver's seat and pulled out of the driveway, leaving everything behind. The truth was, the hardest part of all of this wasn't losing Elizabeth. It was realizing how little I meant to her in the end. She had thrown me away like I was nothing, and for what? For some fling with a guy who probably wouldn't stick around for more than a few months. That wasn't my problem anymore, though. I had a new plan now, a new life to build. I wasn't sure where I'd end up, but I knew one thing for certain: I was never going to let anyone make me feel that small again. Some people say betrayal changes you, and they're right. It takes something from you, trust, maybe, or innocence. But it also gives you something back. It gives you clarity. It strips away all the lies, all the excuses, and leaves you with the truth. Elizabeth wasn't the woman I thought she was. Maybe she never had been. But that didn't mean my life was over. It just meant it was time to start over. And this time, I'd do it on my own terms.